Welcome to Eagle News Live. This is our show, Lawyer Up. We're coming from EBC Studios in Washington, D.C. I'm Blane Brooks, and here today on our show with me is Kathy Ramirez, an attorney licensed in the bars of Washington, D.C. and Maryland. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. Before we get started into the substance of our topics today, let me share with you a very brief statement. This information that will be discussed and presented today is not provided in the course of and does not create or constitute an attorney-client relationship. It's not intended as a solicitation, and it's not intended to convey or constitute legal advice. Further, it's not a substitute for obtaining advice from a qualified attorney, such as Ms. Ramirez.
That's correct.
Some of us would know that if we encountered a traffic accident, just what we should do, how to handle that. However, fewer of us would know exactly what to do if we were faced with a criminal law issue. So for that purpose, we're very fortunate today to have Kathy Ramirez with us to help us think through and discuss some of these issues. Let me ask you about law enforcement generally. Here in the Washington, D.C. area where we are, there's many different law enforcement agencies. So we'll start with a general question. What are the different types of law enforcement agencies here in Washington, D.C. on the federal level?
At the federal level, the Department of Justice is responsible for most law enforcement. And these are the divisions of the ATF, or the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. You've also got the DEA, they have jurisdiction over the drugs.
Right, Drug Enforcement Administration.
Drug Enforcement Administration. And then you've got the FBI, or
I've
the
heard of
Federal
them.
Bureau of Investigation.
Yes. Now, I think many of our viewers might know them from various TV shows. The FBI seems to regularly be featured on those procedural law enforcement shows.
That's correct. And I do believe it's because of the breadth of their jurisdiction. Since they are a nationwide police and they have a number of crimes under their jurisdiction, for example, bank robberies, serial killings, or kidnappings, it makes for interesting storylines.
Indeed. Now, one of the things that I had noticed before is it seems, based upon TV shows, that there had been a change in what sort of topics the FBI was focused upon right around the turn of the century.
That's right, and that's a very keen observation. If you'll recall, in 2001, we had terrorist attacks in the United States.
Yes.
And so our lawmakers passed what is called the USA Patriot Act. And it is meant to intercept and prevent terrorism. All right? So
All right.
That's why a lot of the FBI's resources have now been refocused towards terrorism, anti-terrorism efforts.
I'm glad to hear that they're not focused on creating terrorism, but are fighting it, anti-terrorism efforts.
Let's hope not.
All right, very good. Now, you've mentioned that there are a number of agencies that take care of law enforcement on the federal level, such as the ATF, the DEA, the FBI. Are there others that came out of the creation of the Patriot Act?
There are. Actually, the Department of Homeland Security is responsible for numerous agencies within, such as the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So you will encounter these officers if you ride an airplane from out of the country. The Customs and Border Protection will inspect your belongings and ask you some questions about where you came from, what you're doing in the country, etc.
Now, when I've flown, I've seen some people wearing blue uniforms that were doing inspections.
At the airport.
Yes, that's right.
Those are your TSA, Transportation Security Agency officers. Some of them are also called, I believe, behavior detection officers.
What's that about?
They just stand around and watch people, and they detect suspicious behaviors. So you will notice some people dressed in blue just looking at how people are behaving, how they're handling their things, how they're handling their children, if they're breaking out in a cold sweat
Yes.
in the middle of winter, that kind of.
So anything that strikes those law enforcement officers as suspicious based upon normal behavior and the experience of that officer.
That's correct. And then they can ask you to come to the side where they can speak to you.
All right, very good. Thank you. I think I've been through that before, where I had to remove my belt and go through some special screening.
Right.
Now that, I think, does a great job of helping our audience members, whether here in the United States or overseas, understand some of the aspects of the federal law enforcement level. But in this country, we also have the state level of government, which, as I understand it, is similar to the provincial level of government in many countries like the Philippines, for example. Can you tell us a little bit about police at the state level?
Sure thing. At the state level, as we know, there are 50 states within the United States. And so at the state level, you also have law enforcement. It varies with each state. So for example, in the state of Texas, even before it became a state, they had what is called the Texas Rangers.
Oh yes. Now that's another one I know from television, because years ago there used to be a TV show with Chuck Norris, and it was Walker, Texas Ranger. So I understand that one.
Right. And they have jurisdiction over your highways. If you encounter any police on the interstates or the highways, usually those are state troopers or state police.
Alrighty. So in this area where we live, it's really a tri-state area. If you think about the jurisdictions of Maryland, the District of Columbia, and the Commonwealth of Virginia. If I were to be traveling the local highway, the Beltway as we call it here around Washington, and I got stopped in Maryland, would what I went through being stopped be the same thing as what I would experience if I were stopped, say, in Virginia?
Possibly not, if they have different procedures, but you likely will not be stopped by a Virginia state trooper in Maryland.
Okay.
And that's the difference. So as soon as you cross over the state, while you're on the Beltway, the jurisdiction of the police state troopers will change.
All right, so they're paying attention to where they have the authority to exercise their authority to enforce the law.
That's correct. And it's not impossible for even a county. So within the states, you have counties, which are administrative and political subdivisions within the state. For example, in Maryland, we popularly have our PG County, which is Prince George's County, and Montgomery County. So there are police for Montgomery County, there are police for Prince George's County. They too can make stops on those interstate highways. All
righty. Well, that leads me to wonder a little bit more about the state level law enforcement. On almost every TV show I've seen where there's a courtroom or a jail, there are law enforcement officers. They're not out driving, but they're there administering justice in an indoor environment. These folks who are in the courtrooms and in the jails, oftentimes wearing brown uniforms, what are they doing? What's their focus?
That's a very good question. These officers, sometimes called correctional officers or bailiffs even, they make sure that order is maintained in the courtroom. The correctional officers are responsible for watching over those who have been detained or arrested while they're being held. So these people in the brown uniforms, as you observed, these are usually from the sheriff's office. And the sheriffs are usually part of the county police system.
Alrighty. That's helpful to know, because I've even seen sheriffs on TV before as well, TV shows with sheriffs. We won't talk about Andy Griffith or any of the other sheriffs. You mentioned counties, and I just wanted to highlight that for a moment, because I know that counties are an important part of the political divisions here in this country, but I'm not sure that they have the same equivalent type of jurisdictions in other places. Can you tell us a little bit more about counties?
Counties, as I stated, are your political and administrative divisions within a state. So perhaps the best equivalent in the Philippines would be the barangays.
Right. So it's a smaller jurisdiction, but it also has elected officials.
Yes, that's correct. It makes for ease of administering the state. So even benefits such as health insurance, we would apply through sometimes through the county and through the state health insurance system. For example, in Maryland, it's Health Connections, I believe. So certain benefits through the county are obtainable and run more efficiently because it's done on a lower level. This is also called your local government.
Excellent. Well, that's great information that you shared with us. Let's take a brief break right now from Eagle News Live, Lawyer Up. We'll be back with you shortly. Welcome back. This is Blane Brooks. We're here with Eagle News Live, Lawyer Up, and our guest today is Attorney Kathy Ramirez. Ms. Ramirez, welcome back.
Thank you.
Before the break, we were having a great conversation about law enforcement and legal systems here in the United States. And I wanted to go back to part of what you had spoken about, specifically with respect to the idea of warrants. I hear warrants discussed all the time on these TV shows where they're talking about the need for a warrant. And if you would, share with us a little bit more about the basis by which law enforcement officers are able to obtain a warrant. What do they have to do or show?
Literally, a warrant means a justified or necessitated course of action. And normally,
what's that mean in plain language for the rest of us?
In plain language, you would have to show that there's a reason, a justifiable reason that exists for either searching a person, seizing property, or making an arrest. So a warrant of arrest, literally translated, would be a justified arrest. A search warrant, literally translated, would be a justified search.
All right.
And normally, judges would issue search warrants or warrants of arrest after a police officer or law enforcement signs an affidavit in which they...
which is what, just a written statement?
A written statement explaining the facts and the evidence that are necessary and why they believe they might discover that evidence through a search.
All right. Which raises for me, and probably many of our viewers, another question. Where does that requirement come from? Why do we need a warrant?
A very good question. It all originates from the U.S. Constitution. That's the Fourth Amendment, and it's so important that I'd like to read that straight from the source.
All right.
The probable cause requirement comes from the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which states, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects, against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be searched."
So, two things that really jumped out at me from what you just shared with us is the idea that there must be some sort of reasonableness.
Correct.
So it's not just anything that the government might want, but it's got to be rooted in reason.
Which is your probable cause.
Alrighty, probable cause. And the other thing that jumped out at me was this idea of there being government action or something that the government's doing. So this is about government, not private action. Is that right?
That's correct. And these protections are built in so that the law enforcement or the government will not abuse its power. These are the checks and balances of our government.
Excellent. The Constitution is an amazing document. Thank you for sharing with us the specific language so that each of us can have a deeper appreciation for those laws that actually protect each of us.
Right.
With respect to the Constitution, that's focused just on federal, or does that also have implications for what takes place for law enforcement at the state level?
It definitely has implications for the state level police officers as well. The U.S. Constitution is the national law, and it provides for the fundamental rights of our citizens. So all of the state, county, and municipal laws must be consistent with the U.S. Constitution. If not, they are unconstitutional and they are illegal.
Alrighty, and I appreciate that. Let's make it more concrete for our listeners. Some of them may have even been through circumstances before where they were stopped by law enforcement. Do you have any general advice for what a person should do if they happen to be stopped by the police, whether federal or local level?
Definitely, and we reiterate, this is not legal advice, but it's only meant as information.
All right. Thank you for sharing, yes.
So you're probably familiar with the Miranda rights that people are read even on the television.
Those are the ones where they talk about you have the right to do this,
yes,
and this
that's right.
right will be enforced, and okay, yes.
That's actually based in the law.
Right.
And
Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, sure. You have the right to remain silent is the first thing that you'll hear all the time.
Not when you're hosting the show, but when you're stopped by the police.
That's right.
All right.
If you wish to exercise this right to remain silent, you should say so out loud and not just stay quiet and have them guess at what you're trying to do. So if you want to remain silent, you say, I would like to remain silent.
That's good advice. I hadn't appreciated that.
Right. And then you have the right to refuse to consent to a search of yourself, your car, or your home. So just because you've been apprehended or you have an encounter with a police and he says, I want to search your car, would you like to answer some of my questions? You don't have to.
Now, let me press you on that a little bit. The circumstances when I or other people I know have been stopped by the police, the individual stopping you certainly has a weapon. They are dressed in uniform. They usually take the light on their car and shine it into your mirrors and blind you and disorient you. You're telling me that we have the right to actually challenge them insofar as we might say, no, I don't want to do something. Like I don't want to give you the right to search me. That's
correct. Now, it is our responsibility when you've been stopped to give your driver's license, your proof of registration, maybe even your insurance card, because those things are legal requirements for driving on our roads. But anything above that, above and beyond that, if they are prying into matters that you're not entirely sure what it's about, you can exercise your right to be silent. And they cannot hold that against you. As a matter of fact, I wanted to touch on this. If you were driving at 10 p.m., 10 o'clock at night, in not a well-lit area, and you have someone who's signaling you, who seems to be law enforcement, to pull over, it is completely legal for you to turn your flashers on and drive slowly to a well-lit area.
I like that. Of course, I would try to follow that first advice I got from my mother, not to be out late at night, but that's great guidance if you happen to be out and you're not comfortable with the circumstance or the place where the officer is trying to pull you over.
That's correct. In fact, if you don't feel comfortable about whether this alleged law enforcement is actually the police, the real police or not, you can actually get on your phone and call 911 and tell them your location and ask, is this the real police pulling me over?
That's good to know too, because I have heard stories about people who have been robbed by folks who were posing as the police, but actually weren't.
That's right. That's unfortunate.
That's great advice. Thank you for sharing that with us. Now, there's also other circumstances that we encounter. I've heard on the TV shows that you've got the right to have a lawyer.
That's correct.
Is that, for these criminal cases, is that the truth?
That is the truth. You have the right to counsel. Unfortunately, it's not as immediate as someone would think. After being detained, you are frequently hear, even in the movies, that you have a right to one phone call. That one phone call isn't really limited to just one. That's not really in the Constitution.
I hadn't read about that before. I was wondering about that. All right.
But yes, you definitely have a right to counsel. And if you cannot afford one, you probably heard this in the Miranda rights, one will be provided for you.
Right.
However,
I was going to ask you, do you have any perspective about that? I mean, are there differences between a lawyer that you might pay for or one that you might be given for free?
There are differences, yes. Someone you're paying for will actually take the time out and give it their personal attention. However, within the DC area, the Public Defender Service is actually very good. They do their work very well.
I have encountered them before and understand that they're very thorough in what they do.
That's correct.
Well, it's certainly great if you're in the DC area. Excellent. Now, what about folks who, recently in the news, there's been a lot of stories about immigration. What about a person who might be an immigrant? Do you have the right, as a person who is an immigrant, to perhaps be able to consult with a lawyer? Or is that something that's just forbidden because you're not a United States citizen?
Regardless of your immigration status or citizenship status, you have constitutional rights. So yes, you still have a right to counsel. You have the right to remain silent, even if you're not a citizen or a permanent resident of the United States.
Well, that's great. That's appreciated that you have shared that with us, because that's information that we also do want to cover in some of our upcoming story segments here on Lawyer Up. Let me go into a few more specifics with you if I could. I'm thinking about our listeners, whether here or abroad, but particularly here in this country, that might have an encounter with the police where they get stopped. What is it that a person who's stopped by the police should do?
First of all, you should stay calm and be polite. And it's very hard to stay calm.
I was going to say, that's not always easy to do. In that
situation. So mind over matter. Because keep in mind, just like those behavior detection officers we touched on earlier with a TSA, police officers are also reading your body language for suspicious activity. Now, if you're calm and you're polite, it's likely it's because you're doing nothing wrong.
So if you don't mind, it doesn't matter. Mind over matter.
That's correct.
All right.
Keep your hands in view at all times. No
Why does
reaching,
that matter so much?
Because they're also on the lookout for weapons. That is one of the primary concerns of law enforcement. During an encounter with a citizen, if the citizen is reaching for a weapon. So no sudden movements, and keep your hands where they can see you. Some people have been unfortunately shot after just reaching for a candy bar because it was a shiny silver object.
Well, I won't be reaching for any of those if I have a police encounter later. Now, sometimes people, because they're nervous when they get stopped by the police, might be inclined to tell a little fib and maybe give a false name or try and deny something that's actually true. Do you have any guidance for our listeners about that?
Don't do it.
Okay.
Don't lie. Don't lie or give false documents. Don't, because they'll find out and it'll be used against you. And even when there wasn't a case against you before, there is now.
Indeed. And that sounds like some of the stories we've heard in the law recently, where there was an investigation and the person wasn't found guilty of the substance of the investigation, but ran into problems when law enforcement realized that they had been lied to about something that mattered.
Right.
So Boys and girls, don't lie. All right. Now, that's great advice for what one should do when they're first stopped. Do you have any further advice for our audience about things that they might do after they've been stopped by the police and been processed in the system?
Yes. Prepare yourself and your family in case you are arrested. So that means still keeping calm and figuring out what you're going to do about hiring an attorney, whether that's through the public defender service or whether that's hiring a private attorney for yourself. You should remember the details of your encounter with the police officers. All these details matter. In law school, we learned about the fruit of the poisonous tree. And so every little thing that the police do when they're collecting evidence, for example, when they've done their search, when they've arrested you, when they questioned you, because of the legal requirements built into the system to protect citizens, if they violate one of those and they are able to obtain evidence as a result of a violation of any of those laws, those evidence are considered fruit of the poisonous tree, and they cannot use those against you in the court of law. Right. So it's very important to remember the encounter with a law enforcement.
All right. Well, thank you for that. What about the idea that sometimes you're not driving, but you might just be walking down the street? What if you get stopped by the police for questioning? Do you have advice about what one should do under those circumstances?
The first rule that we laid out earlier remains the first rule here. Stay calm. Do not run. Don't argue. Do not resist or obstruct the police, even if you are innocent or police are violating your rights. Keep your hands where the police can see them again. You may ask if you are free to leave. If the officer says yes, you calmly and silently walk away.
I was going to ask you about that because I can envision many circumstances where a person who's stopped by the police in the course of an investigation may have done nothing wrong. So how long do you have to stay there? Do you have to wait until the police get tired of you and then they finally let you go? Or can you, I guess by asking them, can you leave, you can maybe make that process go a little faster?
Right. You have to exercise discretion, of course, in deciding when to ask whether you may leave. You know, after you've responded with respect to your identity and what you're doing there, you know, and you feel like all of their questions have been sufficiently answered, you can ask, am I free to go? And if you are under arrest, you do have a right to know why. So you may ask, what are you arresting me for?
All right. Well, in a similar way about that question of arrest, let me take a half step back to something you'd mentioned earlier, and I just want to check with you about this. What if the police want to search? I've heard of cases where the police come up and they'll ask somebody, can I search your car? Can I search your bag? Do you mind if I search you? How would you advise our listeners, or what are some of the options for our listeners to consider in terms of how to respond to that request from the police?
You do not have to consent to a search. So you can very well say no, and you will not be arrested for saying no. Now, if the police try to intimidate you by saying, well, I'm just going to get a search warrant, you can say, very well, get a search warrant. That's the appropriate thing to do.
Alrighty. I guess part of me still would be concerned about not submitting myself fully to the authority of the police, but if I'm hearing you correctly, your point is we have rights as folks that are living within this place under the Constitution, so we don't have to give up those rights. We can insist upon our rights and be protected in the exercise of those rights.
You may insist upon those rights, but again, do not engage in a physical altercation with law enforcement. So you may speak your objection, you may speak what you believe your rights are, but do not engage them because they have the weapon and you do not want to get shot at for, for being seen as trying to flee the scene of a crime, for example.
Like you said, it's not always easy to remember, but the fact is law enforcement officers, in performing their duties, do have access to lethal force.
Police may pat you down if they suspect there's a weapon on you. So patting is actually different from what was that we were discussing earlier.
Exactly. I guess that sometimes the police use a little more force and kind of scrunch and feel as they're patting down.
And this is still legal.
So I guess they're looking for those weapons still.
Right.
Well, I do want to thank you very much for your time with us today.
It's a pleasure.
You've given us great insight into some things that we should be thinking about doing if we're encountering law enforcement. And even if we're not, you've given us great background and a way of thinking about the benefits of the Constitution as well as the enforcement of law in our society. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I do want to thank each of you for being with us today during our show. Please join us again where we're going to consider further topics in Lawyer Up, including what one should be doing if you're stopped in your car. We're planning to also have a show about your immigration status if you're questioned about it, what to do if the police come to your home, and what to do if you're taken into immigration custody. I'm Blane Brooks. Thanks again for viewing us today here with Eagle News Live Lawyer Up. We'll see you again soon.